The desert wind carried the scent of rain and gunpowder when she rode in, dust clinging to her coat, eyes hollow as confession. The cowboy had been waiting for the woman he ordered through a desperate telegram, someone to save his dying ranch, or maybe his soul. But when she stepped down and said, "I'm not who you ordered," his hand froze on his holster, his heart on the edge of memory. Something in her voice told him she carried more than secrets, maybe even a ghost of everything he'd lost. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The sun sank like a slow confession, a rim of molten copper behind broken hills, and Asa Cole watched it bleed out over the ranch as if waiting for some mercy to seep back into the ground. His land was a hard thing, dried furrows like the lines in an old man's hand, a wind that argued with the loose boards, cattle standing like specters, ribs etched in silhouette. And Asa, who'd once believed a man's work could bend luck, had learned that faith could dry up as clean as a creek bed. He had sent the telegram because desperation gets tidy when printed on cheap paper. Bring a woman, bring help, bring someone who'll take a fork to the fields and a comb to the house, the note had said, and he had folded his hope into a stamp and waited 3 agonizing days for a promised dancer that might come with tidy manners and a plain apron. Instead, the figure appeared far off against the dusk like an accusation, a single rider cutting the horizon, and the air changed, light like the edge of a blade, storm smell gathering in the heat as if the sky could not decide whether to heal or punish. She rode with her chin tucked against the wind, cloak cut and ragged where it had snagged on fence posts or rocks, the horse carrying the weariness of long miles. When she dismounted, she did it the way people who had learned to keep their bones from breaking do, careful, practical, with a single hand on the saddle horn and the other steady on a revolver at her hip, not the careless swagger of a woman meant for parlor rooms, but the economy of someone who had to count every breath. Asa watched her like a man watching a coal that might still hold fire. He felt the old reflex of a pistol hand reach for his own weapon, thumb finding leather, as if the world might demand more violence than kindness. But her mouth shaped only 4 words that stopped even his heartbeat in its tracks. "I'm not who you ordered." The wind died as if the earth were holding its breath. The horses in the corral paused mid-chew. Even the light seemed to tilt closer, listening. There was a tremor in her voice, not the scatter of a liar but the rawness of someone who had learned to keep their hurt private because barbed questions cost more than pride. Ace's hand lingered at his holster, knuckles white, but something else, call it pity, call it a long-buried kinship, slowed the motion. He remembered telegrams he'd never sent, names he'd left on tongues like stones. He knew what it was to hire salvation and be disappointed when it arrived in a body that didn't fit the invoice. He stepped down from the porch with the careful gravity of a man who'd lived too many winters to be reckless, and when he spoke his words were small as dust, sit a spell. He led her to the barn where the light pooled like gold coins and the shadows were honest. She accepted without a boast, her boots leaving a trail of dust that matched the dust on his floorboards, the kind of dust that belonged to places that had been waiting for rain for years. She didn't answer questions right away. She moved with a familiarity around tools and tact that suggested she'd worked hands until they learned language through labor. And Asa watched the way she checked the horses, the way her fingers found the best knots, the gentleness with which she soothed the lame mare. It unsettled him in a way that felt like memory, like a key fitting a long-closed lock. When the night came and the wind picked up and the sky threatened rain, it kept instead to a low thunder that drummed in the distance. They sat with the barn door open and the world narrowing to the circle of firelight. She blew on cupped hands, staring into the flame as if reading an old map only she could follow, and Isaac found himself listening for the shape of her past in the hiss of the embers even as he weighed the thin ledger of his future. He adorned a halberd on paper, but the woman who answered the horizon carried something heavier than the neat lines of his need. She carried a silence that looked like a wound, and in that silence Asa, who had made a living naming and settling land, felt an unfamiliar pull to shelter rather than possess. The barn smelled of hay, iron, and the slow wet of old rain, and she sat on a bale with her cloak around her like a promise kept at a distance, hands working a strip of leather as if to will meaning back into something plain and worn. Asa watched her the way a man studies a weathered fence post, looking for the grain that tells whether it will hold or break. and the more he looked, the less certain he felt about the tidy ledger he tried to balance with a stamped telegram. He asked her name, and she shook her head gently, the motion measured, as if names were glass that might shatter under examination. Sent by circumstance, not by choice, she said, the words small and exact, and they landed between them like a coin on the floor, ringing with a history Asa could almost hear. Her hands were calloused in the way of those who had worked hard to hide the work's marks from pity. They were not the smooth hands of a woman raised on parlors and prayer books, but hands that had learned to lift, to bind, to steady a horse's head in the middle of a storm. She refused to offer more. No hometown, no kin, no paper trail, only a quiet insistence that she'd be allowed to earn her keep. Asa, who had paid for a promise as one pace for seed, felt the old contractual logic twist into something else, an argument between need and mercy. He watched the hollows beneath her eyes where sleep had not come easy, the lines that grief had etched when it had no other place to lay, and he found himself remembering telegrams he'd never sent, debts he'd not met, the graves he'd visited with his hat in hand, and no words that fit. The barn's single lamp flickered, painting the woman in a light that was at once hard and forgiving. She moved about the place with the quiet authority, mending a broken bridle, checking the grain sack, noticing the mare's coffin, handling it with an efficient tenderness that made Asa think of mothers who work in silence, of soldiers who learn to tend wounds without asking for applause. Town rumor came in trickles at first, voices in the general store, a half smile from the blacksmith when Asa passed by, then quiet questions that smelled of suspicion. Who's she? From where? He deflected them like a man who keeps the shape of his life to himself, and when the woman slept near the dying embers, he watched her there, every line in his face softening like a field after rain. At night, when the world narrowed to the pitch of the barn and the whisper of animals, she finally let words slip through, not a story so much as wet patches of memory, a name of a place that tasted like smoke, a hint of a man's badge in the wrong way, a hand bent under rage. I did what I had to, she said without a plea, and the sentence was both defense and confession. Asa, who had seen lawmen act like weather and kinship like coin, did not press her. Instead, he thought of the advertisement he had placed, neat, practical, and how the person who answered the horizon was not an invoice but a human shaped by violence and survival. He thought, too, of his own small ruins, a daughter he had not saved, a porch that sagged from seasons of neglect, a pride that had choked more than it fed. He let her stay because his ledger of need had room for something else, maybe for someone whose labor would not only bind fence and mend harness but stitch a raw edge of the world back together. The barn held them both in a hush that felt less like a bargain and more like a covenant. Outside, wind lifted dust in slow, bitter spirals, as if the plains themselves were trying to scrub the stain from the air. And inside, by the lamplight, Asa kept watch over a woman with no name and a past that came in small size. He watched until sleep dragged him under, and before he let himself fall, he whispered to the dark, "Who are you running from?" And the answer, when it came, was not a name but a slow, steady breath that sounded like endurance and, perhaps, a readiness to stay. The morning arrived like a question mark, pale light scraping the edges of the barn. The world narrowed to the hush of straw and the distant, slow breath of the plains, and she moved through it with the economy of someone whose life had been pared down to necessities, hands cupped around wire, knuckles scabbed and steady, a rope looped over her shoulder, the motion as practiced as prayer. Asa watched from the loft where the dust hung in slow eddies, each particle a tiny history, and felt that odd mix of caution and relief that comes when a stranger proves useful in ways your ledger didn't anticipate. She mended fence with a patience that suggested she had mended worse things, broken people, broken promises, her fingers finding the weak spots and coaxing strength back into them. And the animals responded to her touch like they knew truth when they felt it. It unsettled Asa not because she could do the work, he had expected that, but because she did it without explanation, as if labor were a language she spoke to make the world comprehensible. The town was a loose web of ice and empty chairs. News traveled like a broodmare in heat, and by mid-morning a drifter came down the lane, hat low, boots speaking secrets against the planks, and when he saw her his step faltered the way a man stumbles over a grave. He muttered something under breath, half question, half accusation. Ain't she the one who? And the name hung unsaid like a thunderhead ready to spill. Asa climbed down the ladder with a silence that was a threat and a shield both. the cold grip of his rifle in his hands a language older than argument. He didn't want to know. Not yet. There are goods you buy with coin and goods you buy with pain, and some costs are too new to tally. But he also understood the town's need to turn mystery into story, to stitch fear into a coat it could wear. The drifter's eyes flicked between the woman and Asa. He saw the set of Asa's jaw and the gun and decided, for a moment, that whatever history the woman carried would remain closed in this yard. He tipped his hat and left, the sound of his boots shrinking down the lane like a withdrawn tide, and the woman, who had not looked up, kept on with the fence as if the world were composed of small, obstinate tasks that would heal things quicker than conversation. Ace lowered the rifle but not his guard. Trust there was a thing grown in increments, a crop that needed tending and protection. When he came closer, she didn't startle. She simply blinked as if surprised only by the proximity of another human being who kept his pain private. "You ever been to Red Hollow?" he asked, the question a soft probe more than an accusation, and she wiped her hands on her rag and said, "Once," and that single word carried an entire country of weather, storm, fire, ash. Without collapsing into detail, he had known people who wore their crimes like hatbands, braggarts and broken men. But her silence was different. It had the weight of something that had been chosen as survival, not malice. The day stretched. She worked and he watched, measuring the economy of emotions with the cautious appraisal of a man rebuilding fences and perhaps, secretly, bridges. In the afternoon, a child wandered by, a neighbor's little girl, curious and unafraid. The woman knelt and tied the youngster's shoe with an easy corner of tenderness that looked wrong on a wanted poster and right in a world that needed mending. Asa felt the knot in his chest loosen a fraction. Sometimes redemption begins with the smallest stitch. Yet the shadow of rumor remained, a presence at the edge of the field. The weighman in the saloon lowered their papers when his name came up, the sidelong looks from the postmaster, the grandmotherly cluck of disapproval from Mrs. Hyle, who had known every scandal in 3 counties. Asa had taken on many burdens, debts, drought, the slow rot of loneliness, and he would carry this mystery too. He had no taste for celebrity or for the town's judgment, only for the honest ledger of work and the bare promise that a roof might be patched, a mare might be healed, and a life might, with time, stop looking like a wound. He kept his questions close and his revolver closer, and when dusk pulled a shawl of violet over the plains, he found her by the trough, watching the horizon as if reading the sky for news of enemies. He stepped up behind her, placed a hand on the cool of her shoulder, not in possession but in solidarity, and for the first time since the telegram he felt like a man who'd chosen to hold the line rather than surrender it to rumor. The town kept its gossip like a hearth keeps heat, close, necessary, and liable to flare. By noon the saloon's sawdust floor hummed with the story as if it were a tune everyone knew the steps to. "A woman from Red Hollow," they said. The one who'd turned a bullet on a badge, the one who'd watched a town burn. And not all fires are that simple. Some are law, some are personal, and most become both in the telling. And the whispers wrapped around Asa like smoke drifting back from a cook fire. The words soft, sharp, relentless. He moves through town as a man does through a storm, each face a small weather report. The barber clipped his shears to stare. The postmistress clicked her tongue behind a ledger. A boy spat where he stood and learned a new phrase of caution. Rumor is a thing that wants company, so it took the form of certainty in the tavern. "She's trouble," said a man whose hands had never known the weight of another's grief. "Better send her on," said another, eager to keep the ledger of life tidy. Asa felt the undercurrent, protective or possessive he couldn't tell, and the weight of that attention sat like a stone in his chest. He left the town's home with a hat low and a mind heavier than when he'd walked in, thinking of the mare and the way the woman had soothed it the day before. The ranch welcomed him with its usual honesty, fences needing mending, the wind asking for work, the horse's flank a heat of pain under a lump that had not eased. He found her there, not at the house where a new arrival might have been shown the parlor, but at the animal's side, kneeling in the dust with both palms on the mare's sweating neck, lips moving in a small, private rhythm that was less prayer than a practiced litany of tending. Easy now, steady now, and the mare's breathing loosened as if memory and touch could change pain into trust. She did not look like the kind of woman pamphlets advertised as help. She looked like a woman who had seen what hands can do to a body and chose, now, to use hers differently. Ace's footsteps were a soft sound on the boards. He paused, watching the way her fingers worked the tack loose. The gentle press of thumb against vein, the way she murmured to the animal as if bargaining with fate. The tenderness unsettled him. Tenderness on a woman with the rumor following her is a contradiction that makes a man think in new shapes. She finished and wiped her hand on her skirt, never meeting his eye at first, and when she did, the light caught the shadow beneath it. The old hollow he'd noticed before, the part of a person carved out by laws. "You from Red Hollow?" he asked. The question was not an accusation so much as a map. It laid out a route he might follow if she let him. She didn't answer at once. Instead, she sat back on her heels and watched the horizon as if the plains might answer for her. "I was," she said finally, the word created like a packed wagon, full of things and leaving none behind. "Before everything burned." The statement landed raw between them. He had expected a tale shaped for his curiosity, a neat explanation to tuck into his ledger. Instead, he got a shaft of memory that refused to be smoothed. The silence that followed was not empty but full of ash and the metallic taste of old law and the brittle edges of towns that burn not just in timber but in trust. Asa thought of the men in the saloon, their mouths working like sheepdogs on scent. He thought of the law's neat stamps and the messy lives those stamps sometimes tried to own. He thought, too, of his own small failures, the house that leaned in the night when he had not walked a field and found what was missing until it was too late. He felt something shift in his ribs, a weary, stubborn compassion that had the shape of a fence he would not let them tear down. "Then you ain't got to explain," he said, and the words were clumsy but true. He was not naive. He knew the land kept score and rumor collected debts, but he also knew what it meant to be desperate enough to send for hope on a paper slip. The woman's chin lifted, and for a moment she was not the rumor and not the burned place, but only a person with a repaired saddle and a worn-out prayer. "I don't want to be trouble," she added, small as a seed. "I just want to work." Asa looked at her hands, at the mare resting now with the coma breath, at the way the light softened the scars on her knuckles. He thought of the dry fields outside, of the thin ledger of his future, and decided some questions could wait. Outside, the wind gathered the town's gossip and carried a few choice words back toward the hills. But inside the ranch's thin walls, new rules were being made, rules that preferred action to accusation, work to rumor, and Asa, who had once measured men by the badges they wore, chose instead to measure one woman by the steadiness of her hands. The storm arrived like an old truth, slow, inevitable, making the plains smell of wet iron and comeuppance. And when lightning split the sky, it threw her silhouette in stark quiet against the barn boards, a cutout of tired shoulders and a revolver that had learned to live between her ribs. Rain began as a whisper and soon was a drum that set the world to a steady, honest rhythm. And inside the barn the two of them sat with the door cracked so the wind could speak and so the horses could smell the change. And she let the rain be a cloak for what came next, speaking low as if the thunder might overhear. Ace listened like a man who'd learned the economy of words, what to spend, whether to hoard, and the lamplight painted the lines of his face in honest angles. He did not ask for the story, but he did not look away either, because some confidences arrive like weather and you do not stop them with manners. She told him she had been married once, that the man wore a badge and a swagger that spoiled into cruelty when the moon tilted right, that he came home with the law in his belt and the temper of a man who thought the world was his to punish. She said the night came when his fist taught the child in their house to whimper and when his hand meant more than discipline, when the bant that promised order bent into an instrument of rage. She said she put a bullet where he meant to put one into her, and the town called it murder and some called it defense and all called it trouble. And the truth, as always, was both narrower and more jagged than any rumor. Her voice did not rise in repentance. It was a plain ledger of facts, names omitted, places scratched like wounds, and sometimes her hands, which held a cup or mended a rope like they were counting prayers, trembled. "He died by my hand," she said, and the sentence held no flourish, only an exhausted sort of accuracy, and Asa felt the room tilt where history met consequence. She told him how she fled into dust in small towns, how she changed horses and names, how every sheriff's bench seemed to smell like accusation, and how the worst part was not the chase but the memory that visited in the night, his face in the lamplight, the sound of the slamming door, the way the child had stopped believing in safety. She admitted she'd hidden the child in the willows one night and come back to find only ash in the shape of a home gone. "Grief," she said, "is not neat, and running is never clean." Asa heard the way her sentences folded into one another, the pauses like stitches between necessary facts, and he understood that the law had many faces, some stamped on paper, some held his weapons, and that sometimes surviving meant committing acts the world would brand as sins. He kept his gaze steady. There was no sermon in his eyes, only recognition of a tired will, of hard choices made in the narrow hours when kindness had failed and only survival remained. He had himself tangled with men in blue once, had worn a badge until it weighed like a lie, and he knew the itch that could make a man lift a hand thinking the world could be straightened by force. When she finished the tale, the thunder softened as if even the storm relented to the small, human truth between them. For a long moment they listened to the rain stitch itself into the night, two people measuring the distance between action and consequence. Then Asa spoke, not with the blunt righteousness of the town, but with the ragged mercy of someone who'd carried his own wrongs. "You ain't who I ordered," he said, and the sentence landed plain, a contract unfulfilled. "But maybe you're who I needed." The words were small, but they held like a repaired fence. She looked at him then, something like relief and something like fear braided together in her expression, and the barn filled with a quiet that had the shape of a promise. Not redemption declared by law, but redemption offered by work and shelter and the steadiness of a man who would not hand her back to rumor. Outside, the storm washed the footprints clean where they met the door, and for the first time in a long while she let herself imagine staying. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The morning came in thin streaks of gray that cut the hills like an accusation, and Asa heard the approach before he saw it. The steady, measured hoofbeat of 3 horses carrying a kind of anger you can smell before you see it. When they crested the rise, the men looked like weather, wind-twisted hats, coats slapped flat with dust, eyes like pinpricks that scanned land as if reading property lines in human faces. They rode slow as if savoring the fear their arrival would make. This was not the brisk patrol of civil duty, but the long, slow stride of men who had made a profession of finishing stories other people started. Asa watched them from the porch with the old reflex of a man who's counted the cost of visitors, thumb finding the worn leather of his holster like a prayer offered in habit rather than hope. The nearest dismounted with the grace of a man who's done this 1,000 times, 2 steps, one hand on the saddle, the other drifting to a badge that shone like a promise and a threat all at once. "Morning," he said, voice flat as a knife. "We're looking for a woman from Red Hollow. Widow." Shot a sheriff out a hand. "Seen her on the road?" Words meant to make a map, to pin blame to a place. The men's boots kicked up dust that crawled into the porch boards and into Ace's teeth, and the sky held its breath as if the plains itself were leaning in to hear whether law or rumor would claim the hour. He stepped down slow, the boards creaking beneath the weight of a man who'd learned to measure his movements, and he felt the pull of it, the choice between a neat lie and a dangerous truth. The easy ledger would have been to hand the woman over to the town's appetite for closure. The kind thing would be to keep her, warm the hearth, close the barn door. Neither was tidy, and both carried their own storms. He met the leader's eyes and told the lie with the calm of a man laying a quiet foundation. "Ain't no widow here." The words came out small, honest sounding, the kind that settle like coal in a hearth. False, but meant to warm and to hold. Inside the barn, the woman watched from the cracked window, the light casting her in lines of shadow that made her look like a silhouette on a wanted poster and like a person at once. Her hands clenched the sill, knuckles pale, every inch of her holding against a body named by rumor. Asa could feel her heartbeat in the way the boards under his boots answered him. He understood the measure of her fear because he had his own reckoning. To light a man with badges was to court their wrath. To shield a hunted soul was to invite trouble. The leader spat at the dust with a lazy contempt. "We got our orders, mister," he said, and the paper in his pocket might as well have been stamped with thunder. "Sheriff's kin don't let things slide. Red Hollow wants what's theirs." There was a righteousness in the tone, a belief that badges make facts and that badges alone draw maps. The other 2 circled the yard like vultures picking through a story, throwing questions like bones to see which would stick. "Were you then? Who you with? What name you answer to?" And all the while their eyes flickered to the barn, to the woman framed in that thin rectangle of glass. Asa kept his hand near the wood of the rail and kept his voice flat, trading nothing but enough to keep the man from digging. "Maybe you looked elsewhere," he said. and the sentence was a stone thrown into a pond meant to hide ripples rather than make them. For a long moment the sun hung low and the three lawmen weighed the lie against their hunger for punishment. Then they mounted with a slow, deliberate sort of disdain, spurs whispering on leather, and as they rode off the lead man looked back once, a curl of contempt shaping his mouth into a promise. "We'll be back," he called over his shoulder, words meant to travel like poison. Ain't no one escapes their own story. The horses' hooves dug grooves into the road, taking the threat away but leaving the echo, an echo that settled into the corners of Ace's porch, into the mare's uneasy breathing, into the woman's hand pressed flat to the pane. He watched them go until the dust swallowed their shapes and the horizon swallowed the sound, and then he turned back to the barn where the woman waited like a coiled animal, eyes bright and wet and terrible with need and fear. He hadn't wanted to know the ledger of her past. He had chosen to carry the burden of the unknown because his land needed hands in his heart, begrudgingly, needed company. But the leader's words had the weight of a calendar, return dates that hang like dusk, and Asa felt the ranch shrink for a moment, as if the world had drawn a line and asked him whether he would stand on one side or the other. He crossed to the window and laid his palm on the glass, between them a thin sheet that meant the difference between confession and shelter, and he said, not as a command but as a pact, "You can't let them give you back to your story." She looked at him then, something fierce and fragile in her face, and the barn filled with a silence that was every promise and every threat the plains could hold. Days unspooled like rope on a workbench, long, measured, useful, and the ranch began to breathe in a different key as she and Asa moved through it together, learning the slow grammar of shared labor. Dawn was for checking fences and horizon, noon for throwing seed into the stubborn earth, dusk for mending what the day had frayed, and in the spaces between the tasks a quiet took hold that spoke louder than any argument. She planted with a methodical hope, sinking corn and beans into rows that remembered rain longer than men remembered kindness, and her hands, calloused, sure, the hands of someone who had tended hurt as much as soil, worked like prayer, turning ash and neglect into the small green insistence of life. Asa watched her from the lean-to and from the porch, and in the moments when work allowed conversation to slip in, he taught her things the land had taught him, how to read the sky when clouds lie, how to listen to a mare's breath for pain, how to track weather in the quiet of the grass. He showed her the run of the river in spring, where the soil would drink without choking, and he taught her to trust a fence line the way a man trusts a friend, straight, true, forgiving when it can be fixed. She learned fast, as if practice were the only sermon she believed in, and the ranch shifted under their hands in small, honest increments, a field plowed, a gate hung straight, a pantry with flour that no longer had to be counted like a sin. They worked in silence more often than not, and the silences were not empty but full of the kind of speech that doesn't need punctuation. The scrape of shovel, the slap of leather, the soft sigh of a horse's load had been eased. Trust grew between them in thin, green shoots, a laugh at noon when a sack torn grain rained like a small mercy, a shared piece of bread with coffee gone cold, and conversation kept to single sentences that did the job of entire speeches. For the first time since she'd come over the ridge, she laughed, a sound like glass warmed by sunlight, and Asa felt something in his chest unclenched like a gate opening. He taught her to ride the open range, to sit a beast that sometimes wanted less of a rider and more of a companion, and she rode with a grin that was both fierce and free, hair whipping like a banner, eyes bright in a way that made the old days, his and hers, seem like stories told by men who've forgotten their endings. Yet even as crops took root and the barn smelled of clean straw, dusk brought a shadow she could not hang on a peg, the horizon, a thin line where past and present met, and in that line rode memories sharper than any spur. She would pause at sunset, fingers still on the fence post, and her gaze would travel along the road as if reading the shape of the rider before he made his shape known. Sometimes her breath hitched and she looked at Asa as though learning to rely on someone else was a new kind of risk. Asa, who had learned the cost of sheltering and the cost of letting go, saw the small tremor in her hands and answered it the way he answered every fence problem, with steadying, practical care. He began to leave an oil lamp burning on the porch when night came early, and he moved to patch the window where the wind whispered like old gossip. He fixed the mare's saddle with extra wraps and left the bread warm on the table, small acts that were contracts without signatures. Neighbors started to notice the change, Mrs. Hale brought over a pot of stew as if offering a truce. The blacksmith stopped by with a new set of horseshoes and a nod that meant something like acceptance, and rumors thinned into a quieter curiosity that watched from porches rather than shouting from taverns. Still, every evening the woman would stand a little while longer at the fence, watching the road with an expression that mixed hope and wary counting, as if measuring the distance between reprieve and reckoning. Asa never asked her to forget. He only asked her to work and to stay, and he honored the quiet spaces where she kept her grief folded. In the slow accumulation of chores and shared bread and the ordinary punctuation of days, something like a life stitched itself between them. Messy, stubborn, unpredictable, and it was in that making that each realized the truth they'd both been avoiding. That trust, like a planted seed, requires the patience to wait and the courage not to dig it up every time a storm passes. The sun sat high and merciless when Asa climbed the barn roof, hammer in hand, the smell of tar and sunburned timber thick as memory. He'd meant only to patch the weak spot near the ridgepole where last week's rain had found a way through. But when he leaned over to reach for new nails, his boot nudged something that slid loose from beneath the saddlebag hanging on a beam, a small, weathered photograph folded soft from being held too often and too tight. He almost called down to her, but something in the stillness of the barn stopped him. Curiosity, guilt, and care tangled together as he unfolded it with a carpenter's care. The picture showed a man in uniform, a sheriff's star catching the light even through the dirt of age, and beside him a boy, maybe 6 or 7, in clothes too big for his frame but with a smile bright enough to make the paper seem alive. The man's eyes were hard, the boy's open, and though Asa had never seen either, he felt the gravity of both. The kind of photograph taken to prove a life once had to order before the world burned it down. He tucked it back exactly where he'd found it, as if not touching truth might keep it from changing shape, and went on hammering while the sound of each strike seemed to echo through a story he hadn't asked to know. By evening the roof was patched, but Ace's thoughts weren't. The woman, he still couldn't bring himself to call her by the name she hadn't given, was out by the fence, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, the last of the day yielding her like the ghost of someone braver. They ate in near silence that night, only the clatter of cutlery and the low hum of insects marking the rhythm of a piece that felt borrowed. When she looked up, her eyes found him watching, and for a second he thought she'd ask what he'd seen. But she didn't. She only stared into the lamp's flicker as if weighing how much of herself could be trusted to the air. The silence deepened until it felt like it could split, and then, without ceremony, the words came, cracked and small but heavy enough to still the night. "He took my boy from me." Her hands gripped the table's edge, her shoulders trembled not from fear but from the effort of holding the world steady. Asa didn't move, didn't speak, just let her voice find its pace. "I buried him before I buried his father," she said, and the sentence landed like dirt hitting wood. She spoke of the man in the uniform, how love had turned to ownership, how a boy had grown in the shadow of fists and fear, and how one night, when whiskey and fury met, the lawman who wore his badge like God struck out not at his wife but at the child who bore his name. She'd stopped him the only way a mother could when the world gives no other weapon but desperation. Ace's jaw tightened, not from judgment but from the quiet understanding that grows only in men who've seen mercy turn to violence and back again. He saw now why her eyes carried that glassy distance, why her hands trembled when a horse neighed too loud, why she never slept near the window when it rained. He'd known grief as a slow rot, but hers was different. It was an open wound disguised as endurance. The photograph had not lied. It was the echo of everything she had lost and everything she could never bury deep enough. He reached across the table then, not to comfort but to anchor, his hand resting on hers, and in that small gesture was a truth older than pity. "You ain't running," he said softly, voice rasped by wind and age. "You're grieving." The words sat between them like a song neither had learned to pray. Her shoulders slumped, a sob rising not loud but raw, the kind that sounds like release more than pain. And outside, the wind creaked the boards as if the land itself were sighing in sympathy. They sat like that until the lamp burned low and shadows overtook the room, two souls tied by the thin, honest thread of understanding. Somewhere, an owl called, and Asa knew the world had not forgiven either of them. But tonight, for the first time, it didn't have to. Dusk bled into the fields like old regret, and the 5 riders who crested the ridge carried that regret in boots and spurs, men whose faces had been sanded smooth by the road and sharpened by whatever law they served. They moved with the slow confidence of those who believe ordinance is the same as truth, and their leader dismounted as if stepping out of scripture, badge catching the last light like an accusation. They spread through the yard like a winter that had finally found a place to stay, and Asa felt the air thicken with the kind of menace that reads less like rhetoric and more like hunger. They called themselves lawmen from Red Hollow, voices flat, mouths set to deliver the town's answer to a question no one wanted to ask twice. Where's the woman who shot your sheriff? The accusation landed in the yard and stirred dust in memory, and when the leader spat the words, harboring a murderer, they were not a summons to civility so much as a sentence meant to be carried out in muscle and rope rather than on paper. Asa stepped onto the porch the way a man steps onto thin ice, calculated, deliberate, and thumped his revolver with the old reflex of a man who has learned the grammar of danger. He could have turned them away, let rumor have the hour, or he could have given the woman up to the tidy machinery of a justice that rarely questions what it claims. For a long heartbeat he weighed the shapes of those two choices and chose the one that had taught him how to keep a house standing through winters. He lied. "Ain't no murderer here," he told them, letting the words settle like coals meant to keep a thing from burning rather than to start one. But the leader's eyes were knives that didn't believe in polite fires. The men answered rolled the yard, voices like leather, and then the crowd from the lane, the curious, the righteous, the gossips, began to gather, drawn by the set of drama like hens to grain. They found Asa and set him in the dust because the quickness of a body is a poor defense against the certainty of a mob. Two men seized his arms, forced him to his knees, and the sun caught on spurs and edges as if the world were being judged by shadow. The leader shoved Asa's face into the earth with the casual brutality of someone practiced at making people small. "If you're hiding a killer, you're complicit," the man snarled, the law's righteousness tasting faintly of vengeance. Inside the barn, the woman heard the sudden clamor and the hard sound of Asa's body hitting the dirt. The wooden frame of the structure trembled with the noise like a throat trying to swallow a storm. She stepped out into the open like someone stepping into a verdict already written, revolver in hand with the steady, familiar grace of one who has carried a weapon as long as she had to carry a name. "He didn't know," she said before Asa could, and her voice cut through the gathering like an iron skeef through fog, an unadorned lie shaped like a shield. Asa's eyes met hers, and in that glance was a geography of truth. He'd seen the way she moved with animals and tools, had heard the tremor of grief in her quiet. His look said what his mouth could not afford to say in front of those men. The leader barked orders and the yard tightened. Someone threw a torch toward the parched field as if flame were the easiest law to call on, and before anyone could stop it, a strip of dry stalk caught, a bright, hungry thing that licked across the land with the speed of accusation. Gunfire cracked the dusk like mortar, two shots that cut the air, a spray of splinters and dirt in the sudden, terrible punctuation of violence, and the world narrowed to a handful of bodies and the scent of smoke and iron. When the smoke thinned and the horses stamped and the men reeled back, two of the lawmen lay still in the dust, the shock of their fall folding the rest into retreat. Their leader, bleeding but alive, cursed and spat and finally ordered withdrawal, fury making him clumsy, while the others mounted and rode hard away, leaving behind the trailed smoke of their impatience. Ace's shoulder bled warm under his shirt where a slug had found him, and he tasted the metallic salt of it when he swallowed. He crawled to his feet on hands that had known plow and nail in the small dignity of honest labor, and the woman dropped the revolver, hands shaking like a leaf in weather. He looked at her then, the barn and the field around them still smoking like a wound, and his voice came out low and ragged. "You should have run." The words were not an accusation but a weary accounting of consequence. She shook her head, a quick, bitter motion that held the weight of every attempt she'd made to outrun what haunted her. "I did," she said, voice small against the vastness of the plains, "and it never worked." In the hush that followed, with the neighbors peering from porches like witnesses to a strange miracle, Asa felt something raw and human pulled between them. Blame braided with gratitude, fear braided with relief, and as he pressed a rag to his shoulder, the barn behind them smoldered and the stars blinked on, indifferent and cold, while somewhere beyond the ridge the road waited, and rumor, once loosened, began to run like a thing that would not be caught again. Night settled with the slow, honest weight of a closed jay, and Asa leaned against the barn post with a rag pressed to his shoulder while the woman set a tin of tea between them, steam lifting like a small excuse for warmth. The lamplight caught the grit at the edges of their faces and turned the barn into a small country where truths could be traded without the town overhead. He had kept his past like a toolbox, neat, heavy, and only open when necessity called, and now the pain made speech less costly. "I wore a badge once," he said, the admission flat and precise. He sketched how the law had been a brotherhood at first, men who shared meals and oaths, how the badge had felt like whether you could rely on. Then the riverside claims shifted into greed and men in blue returned with dirt on their boots and hands that smelled of new fences. Warrants began to look like deeds and justice slid into ledger lines written by men who counted profit first. Asa watched friends sign away others' homesteads and shoot cattle for sport, and he learned the trader's lesson. Sometimes the law's ink is the same color as a man's appetite. He could have stayed to scrub the stain from inside, to brandish the same badge and carp mercy where there was rot. But closing ranks is a quicker thing than cleaning plates. Men protect men and the truth becomes a casualty. So he cut the badge from the coat lining, left the brotherhood like a man stepping out of uniform, and took with him the twin weights of shame and stubbornness. "Guess we're both ghosts of the wrong kind," he muttered, and the line landed between them like a small pact. Long outlaw might share a road when the country's crooked. She listened, the light in her eyes shifting from guarded to something like recognition. She had carried a different burden, one of blood and loss, but the map of exile matched his in places he had not expected. Asa did not cast his leaving as a brave renunciation. He framed it as a necessity visited with regret, a thing done because staying had become complicity. For each name he named, for each deputy he remembered who'd smiled while men went hungry, there was a tiny pull at his chest as if admitting them free a body part to breathe. When he finished there was a long silence in the barn, the kind that measures relief by the depth of its echo. She reached and laid a rough, work-worn hand on his forearm. No absolution, because absolution is paper in view, but understanding. A hand that matched his weight without pretending to lift it. "We ain't saints," she said softly, "just folks trying to live." Asa allowed himself a crooked grin that felt like a door left open. It was not joy but tolerable company with his own failures. Redemption here would not be a parade or a pardon. It would be the small, stubborn work of living without complicit silence, mending fences, feeding horses, finishing what had been begun. He found, in that modest covenant, a brittle kind of hope, that staying and bearing consequence together might be a truer kind of atonement than any batch could buy. The confession rearranged the geometry of the barn. Two people who had been ghosts at the margins now faced the same ledger and, by its light, saw the possibility of writing a different kind of ending. In the hush that followed, Asa touched the band where his badge once lived and let the memory sit there like an old coin, worthless in use but not in lesson. And for the first time he imagined the slow, unlikely mercy of staying and the honest, hard labor of forgiveness. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then. Let's get back on the trail. She climbed the ridge before the sun had decided to offer mercy, the air thin and honest and smelling faintly of dust and last night's rain, and the small wooden cross Asa had carved years ago leaned against the scrub like a truth that refused to be allowed. It was a practical thing. 2 boards, a nail, the edges worn down by weather and fingers, and she knelt before it as if the slope itself remembered every footstep that had passed this way. Asa watched from the shadow of the barn, a figure kept small by distance and habit, because he knew that some prayers must be given room and that watching can be a kind of protection as much as speaking. He did not call to her, did not move to bridge the few yards between them, because the quiet between people sometimes holds more than words and because he had learned to respect the small rituals that stitch grief into a life. She rested her palms on the packed earth, the soil cool and stubborn, and whispered a child's name as if it might answer. Her voice was low and precise, the syllables soft as thread, and each repetition seemed to press a point of memory back into place, the way a laugh used to hang in a room, the stubborn grin in a photograph, the small cold fear that had lived in a boy's chest when men were angry. For a long time she did not look up. Her forehead rested almost on the cross and the whole of her shoulders sagged with the weight of recollection. When she finally spoke, not to the ridge, not to Asa, but to the thin rectangle of air that held the past, her words were not a confession so much as a ledger of what remained. "I buried him before I buried his father," she said, the sentence small and raw, and it landed between them like an ember that might either die or catch. Asa felt a tightness in his chest that was not pity in the soft sense but recognition, the sort that comes when you see in another person's hurt the same whether you yourself have lived through. He had carved that cross for his own child years past, a crude thing made from leftover boards and the kind of dignity a man can scrape together when the world asks him to name his loss. He had been careful with that cross because it was the closest thing he had to a spoken apology to a grave. Watching her there, whispering into the dirt, he realized that forgiveness does not always fall from heaven in gilded forms. Sometimes it arrives slow and human. It walks in through a door and sits at your table wearing someone else's sorrow like a coat. She told the cross about the little hands she had once held, about promises unkept and lullaby the child had forgotten in the living of it all. And as she spoke, her voice hardened and softened in turns, hard with the grit of survival, soft with the ache of not having done more. Asa stayed where he was until she stood and straightened and the ridge took back her silhouette, but he did not leave. Instead, he crossed the small distance afterward with easy, practical steps and set a mason jar of water beside the cross, as if tending a grave were no different than mending a fence. She looked at him then, and for the first time he saw a door open in her face where rumor had only ever painted a wanted poster. There was no theatrical forgiveness on her mouth, no absolution demanded, only a small, feral gratitude and a fragile permission to share the quiet. "You buried him?" Asa asked without the bluntness of accusation, only the flat question of a man learning to ask what matters. "I had to," she said simply, and the answer was a map of desperate choices. He knelt too, not to pray but to touch the grit at the base of the cross with a hand that had known both law and shame, and he felt the thinness of mercy like a draft you can warm with work. Around them the plains stayed indifferent, wind whispering over grass, a hawk folding its wings. But within that small fold of carved timber and two human shapes there was a rethinking of what it meant to carry another's loss. Asa understood then that he could not rescue her from the past, but he could hold a lamp for the road forward. They stood together a long while, shoulders nearly touching, the cross between them a modest monument to names that had been spoken into the quiet of people who keep living when the world tells them to stop. And when they walked back down the hill the air felt a fraction less heavy, as if a small debt had been settled by two hands willing to tend the same patch of earth. Dust came cruel and red, bleeding across the horizon like a wound reopening, and Asa felt the shift in the wind before he saw the riders cresting the ridge. The air grew sharp, metallic, and the horses' silhouettes cut against the lowering sun like black spears. There were more this time, maybe 6 or 7, and they rode with the conviction of men who had convinced themselves that vengeance and justice were twin words for the same sin. The sound of hoofs was steady, rehearsed, like a drumbeat calling ghosts from the earth. Asa knew before he even reached the porch that they hadn't come to talk. Torches flickered in their hands, and in the leader's satchel hung the heavy shape of dynamite. "Look inside," he called, though his voice came out a whisper. The woman didn't move toward shelter. She moved toward the barn, where the horses were tied, and Asa followed, revolver drawn, breath thin and measured. The first explosion ripped the quieter part, sending dirt and light into the sky. Fire leapt along the fence line like it had been waiting for this moment, licking greedily at the dry boards and the hay. The men shouted, some in command, some in fear, and the crack of rifles broke the evening open. Asa took cover behind the wagon, returning fire with calm precision. Every pull of the trigger remembered discipline. The woman was beside him, her face streaked with ash and her eyes a bright defiance in the flickering light. They moved together, a rhythm born not of planning but of necessity, two souls tempered by the same heat of loss. The barn groaned, its beams splitting under the fire's weight, and for a moment the smoke thickened so completely that Asa could not see her, only hear her voice, a single sharp command, "Left." And he turned to find a man closing in through the haze, pistol raised. Asa fired and the man dropped, torch rolling from his grasp and sputtering out in the dirt. But the others came harder now, shooting wild through the smoke, and Asa felt a hot line tear across his arm. "We end this now," the leader bellowed, his shadow long and monstrous in the firelight. Asa's rifle kicked once, twice, until the mechanism jammed, an ugly, metallic click that froze the world. He tried to clear it, but the heat and grit had seized it tight. The leader raised his gun, grinning through the smoke, and Asa thought for a heartbeat about the small mercies he'd been allowed, the woman's laughter at dawn, the peace of mended fences, the sound of the child's name whispered into dust. Then the gunshot came, but it wasn't his. She moved faster than thought, crossing between him and the barrel, the sound of her body hitting the ground louder than the explosion that followed. The bullet had found her chest, the firelight caught the edge of her coat as she fell, and for a moment it looked as though she were burning from the inside out. Asa caught her before she hit the dirt fully, his good arm cradling her weight, his mouth forming a name that didn't exist because she'd never given one. The fire painted them in gold and red, a portrait of ruin, and around them the chaos dimmed into a muffled hum, the lawmen shouting, horses screaming, gunfire fading into the long exhale of spent rage. He pulled her closer, felt her blood soaking into his shirt, hot and wet and terribly human. "Hold on," he said, though he knew from the way her breath rattled that she was already half beyond his reach. Her eyes fluttered open for a heartbeat, finding him through the smoke, and in that look there was something that felt like apology but deeper, like relief. "You ain't who I ordered," he whispered, voice shaking with something too heavy for words, "but you're who I needed." The fire reached the loft, sending embers spiraling into the dusk like souls being released, and Asa held her there as the barn collapsed inward, heat pushing against them like a tide. When it was over, when the last echo of gunfire had fallen quiet and the air was thick with ash, he stayed on his knees, cradling the weight of her in the dirt, whispering a name that still didn't exist but felt right all the same, a name made of breath and grief and gratitude. The world had gone still enough that he could hear her last exhale dissolve into the crackle of the flames, leaving behind only the stubborn pulse of his own heart. One beat for every loss, every sin, every mercy he had not yet earned. Dawn was thin and gray when Asa moved through the burned barn, his boots whispering over blackened straw and splintered boards. He had kept vigil all night, holding her while the fire died into coals and the sky went soft with smoke. Now light found the inside of her coat where blood had darkened fabric and soot had settled like a second skin. Out of habit more than curiosity, Asa checked the pockets, because frontier people keep their truths folded close to the chest. His fingers closed on paper, small, folded, corners singed, the ink slightly blurred by smoke and moisture. He eased the letter free and sat on an overturned bucket, the barn's ruin framing him like a theater of small, private grief. The outside world was a lull, distant horses, a few voices, but the moment was intimate and loud with meaning. He unfolded the page and read an address that named no town and no recipient, "For the one who takes me in." The handwriting was careful, uneven where nerves had shaken the pen, and the signature a pair of initials, cryptic and honest. She had written while on the run or while waiting to be taken by fate. The ink held everything she could not say aloud. The first lines held admission and surprise. "I never expected kindness again," she wrote, as if kindness had been an extinct thing. She thanked whoever would read it for a shelter not bought with coin but offered in the plain currency of work and bread. The letter folded small grief into tidy sentences, a ledger of regrets and fragile hopes, each line a deliberate, honest stitch. She told of nights under false names, of wagons and cold blankets, of looking for a place where no one would come with a badge. She named no names for danger, only the shape of fear. A man with a badge who once promised safety and then broke the world apart. In a single, careful paragraph she admitted the awful trait of survival, actions that saved a child from a hand and left her labeled forever. She wrote of running until running was an ankle-deep habit and of how solitude becomes both refuge and indictment. Then she turned inward and hopeful. She wrote that if redemption came, it would not trumpet itself, but arrive quietly, like rain after the fire. The metaphor was small and stubborn and true, rain that arrives slow and steady and does not undo burned earth but makes new things possible. Her hand had left a smudge where the ink met a darkened fingerprint. Nearer the corner there was a red ring from dried blood. The stain made the words heavier but also real. Sacrifice recorded at the margin of an ordinary sentence, where life and loss intersect. Asa read the closing lines in a hush. "I do not ask for absolution, only a place to work and to learn how to breathe again." The initials were a small cipher, deliberate, private, a sign that she intended not to be traced but to be known in action. He folded the paper back along its worn creases, feeling the faint ridge of blood on the thin page, and the barn seemed to hold its breath. There was no heroic demand on the sheet, only a request for steadiness and the promise that she would repay kindness with labor and honesty. Asa pressed the letter to his palm for a long moment, the paper taking the heat of his skin like an ember passed gently between two hands. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his own pocket as if keeping a small map toward a harder, kinder future. Asa rode before sunrise with the letter folded against his chest and the mare's breath fogging the cold. His face was set from nines kept watching from the memory of a woman who had handed him truth on singed paper. He came to Red Hollow not as a pilgrim but as a reckoning. Deputies lounged where the sheriff's office had been, badges catching the weak light like coins. They greeted him with the easy arrogance of men accustomed to turning warrants into verdicts and verdicts into settlements. He handed the folded note to the first man, who pretended not to see the bloodstain at the corner and watched the paper change their faces. Curiosity, then irritation, then the slow tightening of men who smelled exposure. "Where'd you get this?" the deputy asked, the question hinged that could swing toward confession or cruelty. Asa told them he'd found it in the coat of the woman they'd branded, and that it was meant for the one who takes me in. He spoke plainly about the burn house and the bench that had been more cruel than protective, about a man who carried law like a club and used it to carve other men's homesteads into his ledger. The deputies smiled then. The lead man tried the old maneuver, joke and jeer first, then bluster, but Asa had paid for too many quiet reckonings to fall for the lures they offered. He set the letter on the table and leaned forward until the wood creaked, and the room felt suddenly tight, like a throat ready to speak. He named names not to delight in their fault but to demand the truth, correct the ledger the law had corrupted. The man the town mourned as a martyred sheriff had kept a private ledger of threats and extortion. He had beaten and bullied and claimed rights where there were none, and when the woman acted the night he reached for her child, the crime was a raw, human defense, but the town's batch had shaped the story differently. In Incon rumor, the deputies shifted, their sentences shorter, their faces flintier, and Asa watched the small ways truth irritated them. An eye that flickered, a throat that cleared, a hand that avoided the table where the letter lay open. One deputy tried the old defense. Men make mistakes, men cover for one another, but Asa answered with the dry fact of a man who'd once worn the same blue. Sometimes cover up is worse than crime. Men bury people's lives in colored law. The room smelled of tobacco and the stale cash of authority. Outside, a few townsfolk cocked their curiosity like hens at the fence. Asa did not raise his voice. He had learned that some thunders come without noise. When the lead deputy finally shoved back from the table, his jaw tight, he spilled a truth with the petulance of a man losing a long-used playbook. That man, he threatened property claims. He helped himself to other men's claims in the night. The last word fell like a hinge. The deputy's confession was small, but it was a crack that let light through. Asa set his palm on the table and let the room feel the weight of his steadiness. He did not demand parades, he demanded a ledger corrected. The law answered, not with courtrooms but with clamps and ropes where it was weaker, in men who had to be reminded that justice is not the same as appetite, and the deputies found themselves stripped of the elegant cover their badges had once provided. Asa's justice was plain and frontier-made. He forced men to speak on record, to confess to what they had done and whom they had enabled, and when some tried to flee he followed with the cold efficiency of a man who had learned the cost of idleness. The town watched as the tidy myth of martyrdom unraveled and the truth of a husband who used a badge to hurt settled into sharp relief. There was no courthouse redemption that day, only the small, final gestures the country sometimes allows when institutions fail. Men dismounted in shame, claims were rescinded where they had been stolen, and the deputies who'd lied were led out under a silence heavier than their badges. Asa did not shout victory. He rode home with a letter back in his pocket, the mare's steps steady as a metronome, and the road seemed less like punishment and more like work. At the hill where a crude cross marked his own child's grave, he dismounted, dug with hands that had done honest labor for years, and when the hole was ready he buried a scrap of paper she had left behind next to her initials, the small thing the woman had carried and the truth he had unearthed. He tamped the earth with the quiet reverence of a man who knows that some reckonings end not with fireworks but with dirt under fingernails and the slow act of remembering. Then he stood and watched the wind comb the grass, and in that place where name met loss he carved her letters beside his child's, a final, stubborn act, to lay down a name that rumor had tried to steal and to promise that some mercies are private and some justices are made by hands that will do the work when the courts will not. The barn that had burned was rebuilt with straight planks and honest nails, the loft stacked with hay again, and a lamp always burned on the porch in a practice of remembrance rather than show. Fields that once took the shape of loss now held rows of green and a fringe of wildflowers that pushed through old ash like a quiet insistence. Travelers slowed on the ridge and tipped hats or murmured as they passed, telling a soft story about a man who spoke to the wind and a woman who had once been a ghost in the public mind. Some said he spoke to a ghost, others said he prayed, and some who knew the country better said he was simply keeping company with what the land remembered. Asa moved through this returned life with the slow care of a man who knew where things break and how to mend them. He fixed a wheel. He reforged a hinge. He set a stone for a fence post and taught neighbors what the ground would bear. His routine was small goods that compound, mending harness, teaching boys to ride straight, showing a neighbor where to plant to catch the last of the season's rain, and in these small trades the ranch made its peace with the past. Sometimes he stood on the porch at dawn and spoke aloud into the air, not to summon miracle but to name what he owed and what he would keep. Travelers saw him like that and braided him into their whispers. He kept the little grave on the hill tended, 2 crude crosses now side by side where he had carved one for his child and later laid down letters that named her beside it. And every spring he planted wildflowers there as if color could be a small forgiveness. When people asked why he had done what he did, taken in a stranger and carried a truth out to a town that preferred tidy tailies, he would only shrug and speak plainly about work and consequence and about the small mercy of hospitality. There was no parade for justice, no grand proclamation. There were only the steady acts of a man who chose to keep a lamp trimmed and bread on the table and who would rather shoulder what the town wanted to forget than hand over another soul to rumor. Neighbors began to change the sound of their speech about the place. Suspicion thinned into curiosity and then into the sort of respect given to those who have done the hard work of living well when no one is watching. At night he sometimes spoke into the dark to the woman who had never given a name, saying small truths as if training a bell to ring, that he had buried a badge and learned how small some honors could be, that he thought she had taught him to measure a person by their hand and not their past. The wind carried those words sometimes like a melody that passed the ridge. The country learned that grief can be worn and tended and that people who'd been judged by rumor could root their lives anew if given soil and shelter. Once a traveler who had seen the barn burn many years before stopped and asked him, blond as a plow, whether he believed in ghosts, and Asa answered that he believed in the living, in the ones who kept lamps lit and did the hard work of mending. Years later, the story people told on porches shifted its weight. It was no longer simply a tale of fire and gunfire, but a quiet one about 2 broken people who chose to stitch the world back together in small seams. If you stand on the ridge at dusk and listen, the wind will carry a phrase that hangs like a reed song. I'm not who you ordered. It might whisper in a voice that the plain remembers, and then the wind will answer with the long, patient sound of the presses. In that answer there is a kind of peace that is not clean or perfect, but the honest relief of work done and a name laid down that will not be erased by rumor. The desert and the plains keep their own calendar and sometimes measure mercy by seasons rather than law. And on Asa's land mercy arrived as a slow, steady tending that grew into a life other people could see and, at last, respect. So travelers pass and tell their low stories, and the man on the porch speaks to the wind and sometimes to nothing at all. And the echo of her voice rides the air like a small benediction. I'm not who you ordered, but I was who you needed. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.